Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, the first of two episodes with the Irish writer, broadcaster and historian Fintan O'Toole, discussing the trials of the Easter Rising 1916. Today, we're going to be talking about the Rising itself and the trials, if they can be called that led to the executions in Dublin of 14 of the men involved. And then we're going to be talking about the related but very different treason trial in London of Sir Roger Casement. Fintan, in talking about the backstory to Easter 1916, we could go back a long, long way. I mean, presumably you could go back all the way. I think so that we have somewhere to start, maybe we should just go back to 1914, because the outbreak of the First World War changed everything everywhere, including the politics of Ireland. So I'm going to say something which I know is too simplistic, so you can tell me why it's too simplistic. But one way you could characterise what happened with the outbreak of war in August 1914 is in the months and indeed years leading up to that, the neuralgic fear in Britain of civil war, civil uprising in Ireland was based on the North, Ulster, and indeed what was being driven by British politicians. War changed that. That fear went away, and the focus turned eventually to the south. So uprising, which was a prospect in Ulster, vanished, and the locus of anxiety moved to the south. Is that too crude?
No, it really is hard to overstate the extent to which the fear of civil war in Ireland, which of course would also spill over into Britain because, Glasgow or Liverpool, have huge sectarian tensions which are related to the Irish question. That's very real and not at all hysterical. I mean, you have hundreds of thousands of men under arms unofficially on the island of Ireland. So the Ulster opposition to Home Rule had sort of solidified into the creation of the Ulster Volunteer Force in 1912. Ulster Volunteer Force has like 100,000 armed men, and they're very well funded by the unionist upper class. They're very well organized, and they've imported huge amounts of arms without really any let or stay from the British government. And then in reaction to that, you get the Irish Volunteers, which is a nationalist equivalent. And as you mentioned, I mean, the Ulster Volunteers are being completely encouraged by the Conservative Party in Britain, which has now become the Conservative and Unionist Party. You have, in the months before the war, I mean, it's worth remembering, you have a virtual mutiny on the part of the officer corps of the British Army in the south of Ireland, who say that they will refuse orders to move against the Ulster Volunteer Force. Right? It's not technically a mutiny because they resign rather than face this prospect. And effectively, the British government gives in and says, we will guarantee the British Army is not going to be used. But, this is a really very serious prospect. And we know as well that it feeds into the calculations of the German high command when they're thinking about the war, and calculating that Britain won't come into the war on the side of France. One of their big calculations is, well, they can't afford to because there will be civil war coming in Ireland. Right? And of course, what happens then, very often, the way history functions is that it has the opposite effect initially, which is that, as everywhere else in Europe, there is very large-scale enthusiasm for the war. It's going to be short. It's going to be glorious. Everybody can join in this great cause. And so what happens politically is that Irish Home Rule has been finally passed by the British Parliament. It's suspended, so it doesn't come into operation because of the outbreak of war. Obviously, the Ulster Volunteer Force almost en masse joins the British Army and is going to be sent off to the Western Front. But also in what's now the Republic in the south of Ireland, the overwhelmingly Catholic Irish Volunteers, well, they split their leader, John Redmond, urges their members to join the British Army to fight for the rights of little nations like Belgium, Catholic Belgium, of course, and the large majority of the Irish volunteers take that leadership. You have a split where the militant Republican faction, which will come into our story, are, of course, opposed, very much opposed to that order. But initially, at the end of 1914, you would have said, well, they're sort of not very important. They're the same people we're used to seeing protesting about everything British. And yes, they've got a couple of thousand people under arms, but they're not going to be a serious threat. And certainly the British government doesn't regard them as a serious threat at the end of 1914.
Was the calculation among those who said Catholics in the South should join up and fight for the rights of little nations that Ireland would get its reward for that? Because this becomes part of the rhetoric during the war. That becomes a less and less plausible claim. But in 1914, was there a feeling that this war in the end is being fought for little nations and will benefit little nations, so we can fight it in the name of the British Crown, but actually really in the name of a nation like Ireland?
Yes, so the propaganda really that comes from Britain as to why you should join up, it's simple enough for the Protestants in what's now Northern Ireland in the north, which is king and country rather, the empire
And the Union as well.
and the union, absolutely. But for Catholics in the south, it's much more complicated. There are certainly some Catholic loyalists who do feel, they want to be part of the empire. I mean, they want home rule, but they still identify with the British Empire. But the vast majority of them, and this is the argument of their leadership, is that, they buy the argument. This is the war for civilization. Germany is the vile aggressor. The invasion of Belgium, is this huge trigger, atrocity propaganda. I mean, all of that actually is very effective initially. Now, one thing that's very interesting, however, is that the British authorities, as the war goes on, are still very reluctant to impose conscription in Ireland. So obviously they do so in Britain, but there's still a sort of understanding that this might be a step too far. They will eventually try to impose it, but they're very reluctant to do it because they understand the sensitivities around this. And actually, what that means is that they have to rely on volunteering. So it has to be quite heavily emotional and propagandistic. And undoubtedly, the most potent propaganda message is that this is for the rights of small nations.
That group that you said held out, the usual suspects, but the ones who didn't fall for the propaganda and ended up being the leaders of the movement for Irish republicanism and Irish independence. When they looked at the calculation that Germany had made, which turned out to be a miscalculation, Britain won't join this war because they've got a war brewing inside the nation. Turned out the war was the solution to that problem. But nonetheless, quite early on, the leaders of Irish republicanism seemed to think that Germany was at least potentially the route through which they were going to get military support or arms, financial support, the impetus that they needed. Was that plausible? I mean, do we think, with hindsight's an easy thing, but at the time, in 1914, 1915, this small group of people in Ireland holding out for Irish independence, was Germany a plausible saviour of their cause?
So I think the first thing you've got to realize is that this is absolutely in the DNA of radical Irish separatism, which is that we're never going to be able to do it on our own. They're not idiots, right? They understand the power of the British Empire. But, going right back to, if you take the two biggest Irish revolts historically, the 1590s, the 7 Years' War, which, comes pretty close actually to establishing a kind of Irish independence. You look to Spain, which is the big Catholic power on the continent, and Spain does provide troops and arms, and so, it's reasonable. And then the 1790s, the Revolutionary Wars, Irish revolutionaries look to revolutionary France. And, it's sort of imprinted on the radical nationalist mind in Ireland that this is possible and it's what you do. The great kind of missed opportunity is 1796, when you actually have a vast French fleet with, this crack French army just off the west coast of, or the south coast, actually, off the coast of Cork. you could see this fleet in Bantry Bay, and then the wind comes up and it can't land, and who knows what might have happened, you know. But that's very much in the mind of every kind of radical Irish nationalist. And of course, it's not unreasonable to think that the Germans might win, and that, you know, it would be in Germany's interests to use Ireland as a way of staging a kind of invasion of the British Isles and possibly forcing Britain out of the war.
And what about the United States? The United States is not in this war in 1914, 15, 16. That all happens afterwards in 1917. How much impetus for armed resistance was coming from the United States?
So it's huge. You know, you really can't really understand this nexus if you don't take into account the Irish nationalist diaspora in the United States, which of course is vast, you know, and it's very politically powerful at this point, you know, particularly in the cities of the East Coast. And you had sort of a movement generally called the Fenians. They called themselves the Irish Republican Brotherhood, secret revolutionary organization, attempted to stage a rising in Ireland in the 1860s, failed, and a lot of its members had gone over to America, you know, into exile. And you still have some of these people active, you know, in 1914, 1915. A particular guy called John Devoy. Devoy is hugely influential. He can raise money. He can sway Irish American opinion. And Devoy is pushing for a rising. You know, this is what he wants to see. The almost cliched phrase in the minds of radical Irish nationalists is England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. So clearly, England is in great difficulty, especially in the early years of the war. You know, it very quickly becomes clear that this is not going to be an easy victory, or indeed necessarily a victory at all. I mean, you know, nobody really knows. So Devoy is agitating. He's very kind of connected to the radical revolutionary nationalists in Ireland. And it's really through Devoy that the first real connections with the Germans are made. So these connections happen in New York first. And Devoy is able, well, not really able, but he promises the Germans, of course, that he can raise huge amounts of money, guns, even troops in Irish America, and he can get them to Ireland, you know, as part of this putative war in which they will be allied with the Germans. So from the German point of view, this is at least worth exploring. It's not innately incomprehensible as a possibility.
And yet, by the time we get to Easter 1916, we're going to talk about Roger Casement a bit later because he's part of that German story. But by the time we get to the uprising itself, there has been, as you say, all this big talk. And in the United States, it's not just Irish Americans who are happy to see Britain lose. German Americans are. You know, America, before it joined the war, there was huge divisions about which side it should be on, if on any side at all. So there's big talk, the possibility of all of these forces coming together, a historic opportunity. And yet, by the time we get to the actual uprising, it doesn't amount to much. Is that because it just fizzled out? Is that a failure of planning? Why did that talk really go nowhere?
It's a fascinating question, really. I think there's a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that, you know, Irish participation in the Great War is very substantial, you know, and that itself has consequences, right? Emotional consequences, right? So you increasingly have an awful lot of Irish families, including Irish Catholic families, who really have a dog in this fight. You know, they have their sons, they have their husbands. The idea that the more suffering there is, the more it sort of binds people to a sense that actually, you know, this war has to be won. And there's also the simple fact that the Irish revolutionaries are really terrible revolutionaries. I mean, they're extraordinary people, you know, they're full of idealism, they're full of energy. Many of them are really brilliant people, but their military knowledge, their military capacity, right, is really pretty terrible. There isn't a single person among them who, you know, who's ever led an army into battle. You know, few of them are former British soldiers. They've got some military training, but really they don't particularly know how to organize a war, which is effectively what they're talking about. And psychologically, I think this is where the German thing is so important to them. I mean, they kind of recognize this themselves effectively, right? Which is that they need not just German guns, but German officers. German logistics, German military capacity, planning. So they do draw up extensive plans for a rising, but those plans, they seem to be mostly drawn up to try to impress the Germans, to say, look, we've got this kind of big national rising, but there's not much evidence that they have any great capacity to put those plans into action or that they've really thought them through in any enormous detail. They're fairly weak, I mean, you're really talking about probably not much more than about 4 or 5,000 people that they could call on, and there's no realistic prospect that a amateur army of that size is ever going to defeat the British Empire, which, remember, at this time, of course, is fully mobilized for war. The British, and of course this turns out to be the case, I mean, they can move vast numbers of troops from camps in the west of England, in Wales, in 24 hours. They've got the ships, they've got the railways, so it's not a realistic prospect. And so one of the questions that hangs over all of this is that if you take away the German side of it, do they really think this is going to be a successful revolution? Or do they think it's going to be essentially performative? It's going to be a drama. And to be fair, the drama aspect of it is not as daft as it seems, right? So you've had all this rhetoric about the rights of small nations. It's not unreasonable to think at some point there's going to be a peace conference. And if Ireland has shown its desire for independence through a rising, it will have a case to say, well, actually, we should be at the peace conference. We are belligerents, and we've shown that we're serious about independence, and home rule isn't enough for us. So those kinds of things are certainly feeding into this. But what really happens over time as the German option gets weaker and weaker, the idea of this rising as a kind of massive armed demonstration rather than a serious war, I think takes hold more and more.
How then divided was the leadership of the Irish Republican movement on that very question, when it's clear the cavalry is not coming? And so you might have had dreams of what was possible, but they're just dreams. And yet many people were committed to this. Announcements had been made, presumably word had been fed back to the United States. So there's a question, do we go through with this in the absence of the only thing that could conceivably make it work? How divided was the leadership as to whether this should happen at all?
So they're very profoundly divided. And one thing that feeds into this is that makes it slightly more complicated, right? Is that you've got this sort of public organization called the Irish Volunteers, who are like, they're drilling around the streets. I mean, it's very hard for us to get our heads around, I mean, they're staging mock attacks on Dublin Castle, which is, the centre of British administration in Dublin. They're doing all this stuff very openly. And the British don't want to move against them, partly because they see them as an irritant rather than a serious threat. And maybe not unreasonably, they're saying, look, if we just go and lock them all up, that itself is going to create trouble. And creating trouble in their eyes is stopping recruitment. Anything that's going to stop recruitment, remember, there's no conscription, so it has to be voluntary. You don't want trouble on the streets of Dublin. So they kind of tolerate this. So you've got this public organization which is out there. But then you have the Fenians. This goes back to, the 1860s and John Devoy and all that, which is the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And the Irish Republican Brotherhood is dominated by the radicals, particularly people like Patrick Pearse, and they operate in secret. So they're kind of, as you say, they're completely committed. They're going to have a rising come hell or high water. But the public leadership of this nationalist Irish Volunteers, really, you people like Owen MacNeill, who is the head of it, who's an intellectual and Irish language scholar. Bulmer Hobson, who's a very interesting guy, kind of actually from a northern Protestant background. Hobson is the real organizer of the Irish Volunteers. He's probably the most important person in kind of making it work. And O'Neill and Hobson are very clear in their minds that it would be grossly irresponsible to stage a rising that has no chance of success. And in their minds, that really does equate to really serious German support, So they're not of the sort of romantic, let's make a blood sacrifice, let's make a kind of national drama side of this. They're looking to the practicalities. So you absolutely have that split. A third factor in this is to remember that in Dublin in particular, you have one of the first kind of red armies. So you have the Irish Citizen Army, which has been formed by the working class socialist movement, led by James Connolly. It's one of the first kind of, socialist militias formed in Europe. This will obviously become very important elsewhere. It's small, but it's very committed, very disciplined. And Connolly is also completely committed to a rising. So Connolly's going around saying in early 1916, I'm having a rising whether you guys are going to do it or not. And Connolly's a very charismatic, powerful, persuasive person. And so this is also adding into the psychology of the militants, right? The shame. So if Connolly stages a rising, it would of course be crushed. But, if we weren't part of it, we would be, even in our own minds, we would look like cowards. You can never kind of underestimate the First World War atmosphere of a masculine courage. You have a lot of evidence from subsequent witness statements that particularly female members of the citizen army, female activists are going around basically taunting the men, saying, why are you waiting? Well, why are you afraid? They use this contemptuous term called the fan gafoils. Fan gafoil in the Irish language means wait a while, wait a while, just hang on. And this is used as almost the equivalent of the white feather sort of thing in Britain. So all of this is kind of feeding into this idea that you have this hard core of people who are absolutely committed to doing it. And then they decide the religious thing is feeding into this as well. So they're going to do it on Easter Sunday, the resurrection. And I think once you've chosen Easter Sunday, you're not choosing that for military purposes, particularly. You're choosing that for symbolic reasons. And so the symbolism, the poetry, the religious idea of blood sacrifice really has become very, very important.
As you said, socialist militias are going to play a significant role in subsequent political events. And one of the things that's hard to know how to judge with this case is that pretty quixotic attempts at new regimes being created by ragtag armies were going to succeed in various places in sort of weird ways. The Bolshevik Revolution is one. The uprising in Bavaria after the First World War, the Spartacist uprising was crushed in Berlin. The fascists marching on Rome, they're on different scales, but nonetheless, the successful ones were pretty improbable before they succeeded. And this one, it was crushed, but in some ways, it lasted a bit longer than people thought, and the British turned out to be, until they really got their act together, not particularly well equipped to know how to respond. And so there is at least the possibility of a what if here. What if the movement had been united? What if there had been at least some attempt at a national uprising? Never mind what if the Germans had arrived, but given that not all of these seemingly hopeless causes were hopeless in the next 4, 5, 6 years, is there a plausible what if here? Or do you think actually in the end it didn't make that much difference, that this was a minority of a small movement who went ahead with it?
I think the plausible what if is in a way the lesson that somebody like Michael Collins will draw from the failure of the 1916 Rising, which is don't do it that way. Okay, there is a plausible, and in fact, it turns out to be very plausible, right? Which is there is an Irish armed revolutionary possibility, which is to do with guerrilla warfare, right? Which is to do with occupying the countryside, attacking police barracks, attacking the army when they're on the move, staging what you can imagine is going to be a multi-year guerrilla war against the British Empire. I mean, that's plausible. I think because of the importance of symbolism in their heads, so far as we know, there seems to have been no consideration given to guerrilla warfare, which is a sort of obvious thing for them to do. So it's very much based around this kind of weird idea of occupying buildings, static. I mean, literally static. I mean, occupy these buildings and try to defend them. And, that's really a obvious recipe for military defeat. As you say, the extraordinary thing is they hold out for the best part of a week, which itself is a testament to their courage, but up against a massive professional army, just say, come and get us, copper, is not a very good strategy. Even in terms of symbolism, the most important thing for them to do was to capture Dublin Castle, which we mentioned. Dublin Castle is in the centre of Dublin. It's the absolute centre of the British administration. So both practically and symbolically, its capture is hugely important. And they tried to capture it on the first morning of the Rising, but weirdly, and it turns out like there's only something like a dozen or 20 British soldiers in the castle. They've all gone off to the races. They're not expecting anything. And they could have captured it really quite easily, but they sent a very small force and they're stopped and they don't manage to do that. And so even in terms of the planning of like what's really important here, the first thing you would want to do is Dublin Castle is defensible. It has a perimeter, symbolically hugely important. It would also have disrupted, of course, the British administration hugely. This is where the centres of communications are. This is where all the orders are going to come from. So it wouldn't have meant they would have won in the end, but it certainly would have made it a much more interesting, just in purely military terms, a more interesting set of possibilities. But they really, they end up occupying the General Post Office in Dublin, which is, I think, chosen because it's a big official building right in the centre of the city rather than for any kind of really thought through military purposes.
The week was full of theatrical moments, moments that became legendary, but it was a week and it ended. The British did get their act together eventually, and it ended pretty violently. And then, as is, I think, traditional, followed by mass arrests. Many hundreds, I think more than 1,000 people were arrested, but including the so-called leaders of the uprising. Though, as you said, it's not completely clear who counted as a leader in an uprising of this kind because it was not particularly well led. Do we have any sense of what the British thinking was in the aftermath of this? So first of all, do we know how shaken the British were by this? Do we know the extent to which they thought we're going to have to make an example of some of these people? Because it was pretty repressive what followed, but also, as we're going to talk about now, the legal proceedings that followed were effectively kangaroo courts.
Yeah, so the British haven't really, as we said, taken these people very seriously. The Dublin Metropolitan Police do have sort of intelligence files on a lot of them, which wouldn't be that difficult. I mean, you can see them marching around the place, but they haven't taken them seriously to the point. I mean, it is extraordinary when you think about it, right? So the prelude to the Rising is, Roger Casement, who we're going to talk about, coming with German guns, okay, not the German officers of the German army, but a lot of German guns, they're intercepted. The British know that's coming. It's intercepted off the coast of Kerry. The ship is scuttled and Casement is arrested, right? So you would think, oh gosh, there must be something happening here over this weekend. They've just tried to import 40,000 rifles. But instead they say, oh, we've intercepted the rifles. We can go to the races. It's Easter weekend. It's nice, lovely spring weather. Let's just, forget about it. And which they pretty much do. So yes, they are initially taken completely by surprise, weirdly. The rebel leaders themselves, they postpone, the Rising is supposed to be on Easter Sunday, they postpone it till Easter Monday, and they're sort of expecting to be arrested before they can stage the Rising. They think, we're going to be rounded up, obviously, we're going to be rounded up, and nothing happens. So, yes, you can certainly see that there's this extraordinary complacency on the part of the British authorities. And then they don't know, the immediate response is martial law. So it's very interesting the way they go from sort of softly, softly to the colonial thing is going to kick in, right? This is like, how do we deal with native insurgencies, yeah, in India or in Egypt or whatever? Martial law, they crush the Rising pretty quickly. They shell Dublin. They do all that. They round them all up, as you say. They round up roughly about 1,000 people. What they do initially is they do kind of a triage on it, who looks like they're in an officer's uniform, for example. Remember, almost all the rebels are wearing uniforms. So you can kind of tell, well, that guy looks like an officer. Most of them are kind of pretty immediately kind of taken out of Ireland, shipped off to a prison camp in Wales. They also start rounding up people who have nothing to do with the Rising whatsoever, the usual suspects, whatever, and they're shipped off. So they're left with a couple of hundred who by and large are the sort of, officer corps, and they do recognize some of them. They identify quite a few of them. But other than that, they've got very little sense of what the command structure is, who's really important. They think some people are very important who are very unimportant. And this becomes a matter of life and death. If the British think you're very important, you're probably going to end up being shot. And if they don't, you may well survive. A good example of this is a guy called John MacBride. MacBride, the British know all about him because he had organised an Irish brigade to fight for the Boers in the Boer War. And he's a kind of famous nationalist militant figure. He's sort of regarded by a lot of people now as a little bit of a joke at this stage. MacBride turns up on the Monday of the Easter Rising at one of the garrisons, says, "Can you let me in? Can I join?" He describes being in a lounge suit. He's not in uniform. He's not. But when they start making the arrests, they say, "Oh, well, MacBride, obviously, we know this guy. He's very important, and he's going to end up being shot." Whereas some people who actually are, like Michael Collins, for example, they've no idea about it because, he's been in England, he's come back, so, it is one of the ironies that somebody like Collins, who will prove to be a real thorn in the side of the British, are essentially going to be let go eventually, whereas a kind of harmless old geezer like John MacBride are going to get shot.
And de Valera as well, right? He could have been rounded up and he wasn't. Is that right?
Well, De Valera was rounded up. So De Valera has a kind of funny standing in all this. So De Valera is a commandant, right? So he is one of the very senior commanders. He has his own battalion, if you like, in the south part of Dublin City. As it happens, a detachment from that battalion is the one that inflicts most casualties on the British Army because these guys, they command the main road coming in from Dublin Port into the city. So all the poor unfortunate 17, 18-year-olds, guys who were in training camps in Wales who were moved over are coming down this road, and a very small number of snipers really are able to inflict huge casualties on them. And that's part of De Valera's battalion. So if the British were being logical, they would have said, like, this is the guy whose detachment inflicted most harm on us. As it happens, De Valera never reinforced that battalion or that detachment who were doing this. He's off, in Boland's Mills, the bakery, basically does nothing all rising. But technically speaking, he is the commander of the most dangerous rebels. And he is a commandant. He's in his uniform and he organizes a surrender. They can see that this guy is very important. And he's definitely on the list to be executed. But there's an element of luck in all of this as well. When I was a kid, De Valera was still president of Ireland, and the myth was that he wasn't executed because he was American by birth. He'd been born in New York and was an American citizen because, as you mentioned, America coming or not coming into the war is such a huge issue for the British that they didn't want to offend the Americans. There's no real evidence of that at all. It seems to have been mostly luck in that, by the time they got to De Valera, the executions had been in train. There was public reaction against the executions, and they were just easing off at that point. So there's an awful lot of luck involved in all of this. Names, I mean, poor unfortunate guy called Willie Pierce, who's Patrick Pierce is, certainly, one of the main leaders of the Rising, undoubtedly. His younger brother, who's his kind of aide de camp, gets executed. Why? Because he's Patrick Pierce's brother. He has no real political or military standing whatsoever. So it is somewhat random and disorganized, but it's all done under martial law. And this is why you get the kind of kangaroo courts, as you say, that are staged.
As you said, in a way, there was just a list of people. The calculation was we're going to have to shoot some of them. A list was arrived at. Maybe when enough had been shot, the people at the end of the list could drop off it. That's not a legal proceeding in any sense. If you have a list of people you're going to shoot, that's a list of people you're going to shoot. And yet there were these courts martial. An early decision was taken that they would be held in secret, so none of this is public. I think we now know a certain amount about what took place in these proceedings. There is documentary evidence. But were these in any meaningful sense trials? I mean, that's one of the questions I'm really interested in here, because we're going to talk about a real trial. The trial of Roger Casement is a real trial, has all the recognisable forms. It takes place in London. It's a treason trial. But these are more like summary executions.
Yeah. So what's important here is that there is a veneer of legality here, right, which is the Defence of the Realm Act. So in the conditions of wartime, the Defence of the Realm Act has been coming in. It's given sweeping powers to British authorities, British government, in Britain as well as in Ireland, to do whatever they like, really, to people who are seen as a threat. So martial law is proclaimed. Now, a critical thing to understand here, though, is that what the proclamation of martial law sets out is that civilians can be court-martialed. I mean, this is strange for us, right? Court-martials in and of their nature are about military discipline, right? That's what they're there for. But there is this provision that says civilians under the Defence of the Realm Act, if you're engaged in anti-government activities, you can be court-martialed as if you were a soldier. However, this is the key thing. That very stipulation also says that those court-martials cannot impose death sentences unless there is proof that the crime has been committed in collusion with the enemy, basically with the Germans. So, by their own lights, right, they have to prove that these people were acting in consort with the Germans. Now, what they then do is instead of having court martials, they're often referred to as court martials, so they are, but they're worse than court martials, right? So, a military court martial, a proper court martial, kind of mimics a normal legal process, right? You have a defense counsel, you have evidence, you can call witnesses. There's a judge advocate general who is at least supposed to be an independent judge. However, there's a lesser form of court martial, which is called a field general court martial. And this is the one for at the front. David Runciman runs away when faced with the enemy. He's hauled in. You want to make an example of him, basically have him executed at dawn. We know this happens to a lot of people. You do your field court martial, which is, doesn't have any of these protections. And it's basically, yes, it is more or less a kind of summary execution. It's what we often think of as a kind of drumhead court martial. Right? So this is the form that's used for the 1916 leaders, which means that it's in secret. There's no independent judge advocate general. There's no independent counsel for the accused. They can't call evidence. They can't call witnesses. They can't even speak in their own defense, right? So they're allowed at the end to make some kind of statement, but they can't really, say why they didn't do it. And so this is really a charade. What's fascinating, David, though, is that how do they prove that these guys were in collusion with the Germans? Right? Remember, this is all being done very, very quickly. So it's being done like within days of the ending of the Rising. They haven't had time to gather all this evidence. Of course, they know from the arrest of casement and all that, they know that they are in collusion with Germans. But how do you prove this? And they prove it by the most lethal postscript to a letter. So I just thought I might read you. This is the key document, really. So Patrick Pearse, who really is effectively the leader of some kind of disputes about who technically is or isn't, but Pearse is the sort of leading figure. He's been named as the president of the Provisional Republic. I think Pearse wants to be executed. He is at this stage very deeply committed to the idea of martyrdom because he's committed to the idea that now this is a symbolic event. And its symbolism depends absolutely on blood sacrifice. It's a military failure, but people will see that I am willing to give up my life. So Pearse, on the 1st of May, he writes a letter from Arbor Hill Prison, where he's being held, to his mother. And it's a sort of touching letter explaining to her what's happened. So the core of the letter is this, right, where he says, "You must not grieve for all of this. We have preserved Ireland's honour and our own. Our deeds of last week are the most splendid in Ireland's history. People will say hard things of us now, but we shall be remembered by posterity and blessed by unborn generations. You too will be blessed because you were my mother. P.S. I understand that the German expedition, which I was counting on, actually set sail but was defeated by the British." Astonishing, absolutely astonishing, right? I mean, he's not an idiot, right? He was a trained barrister. And of course, he knows that the letter is going to go to the British authorities, to General Maxwell, who's now, under martial law, basically governing Ireland. The British authorities get this letter and say, "Thank you very much, Patrick Pearse, the German expedition that we were counting on." So why does he put that in? He puts it in, I think, because he wants to be shot. But, and this is, to me, the extraordinary thing, is he's also condemning his fellow prisoners to execution.
Including his brother.
Including his brother. Now, to be fair to him, he may not have thought that they would kill his brother, because his brother really was neither here nor there, But he certainly knows that Connolly and McDermott and Plunkett and, all these, his closest colleagues, he's now given the British the legal authority to shoot them. right? And this is what makes it so strange psychologically. It's very hard to believe he put that in a letter to his mother just accidentally. So it makes the whole thing kind of very strange, and it's sort of we'll come back to this when we're talking about casement, but this idea that it is a drama, and it's a drama which now must have its proper ending, which is our execution. Now, some of the poor unfortunates who are gonna be shot have no intention of being shot. I mean, they really don't. I mean, these are utterly grief-stricken and, just shocked by the fact that they're gonna be shot, and they've got kids, and they've got wives, and it's just horrific for them. They don't want to be part of this game, but Pierce has, in a sense, created this. So you have this sort of strange, almost collusion going on between both sides where Maxwell and British authorities, yeah, they just want to shoot them, and they want to make an example. This is deep in the British colonial mentality, but you also do have someone who wants to be shot. So, as you say, the actual trials are not really worthy of the name. Some of these trials last 15 minutes, 20 minutes. They're preordained. It's worth saying, and I'm not for a single moment excusing General Maxwell, but in Maxwell's mind, the British are being very lenient. I mean, in the end, only 14. I mean, it is very small. It is to do with the fact that they're white people, Europeans. They may be the wild Irish, but they're still kind of us. There's no question if this was India or Egypt or an African country, you would have had mass slaughter. You would have had thousands and thousands of people executed. So in their minds, I mean, remember, Maxwell, these are all colonial operatives. I mean, Maxwell's come from Egypt. This is sort of we're being really quite nice to them. There were death sentences, I think, on about 90, and only 14 are shot in the end. It feels from the British point of view like it's enough to make the point, but not enough to be cruel. And this is again why they miscalculate. They can't understand why is there this sort of reaction to this? Why is it seen as being uniquely cruel?
And that's the next question, because given this has now become a theatrical event, a lot of this is about symbolism now. The threat to the British state has gone away, if it was ever there at all. Why did the British not sense the ways in which these secret hearings, these summary executions, doesn't matter how many, in a way, 14 makes it easier to identify the martyrs to tell their stories? Why did they not sense the way that this was going to play out?
You have to say that it is to do with the fact that Irish Catholics are still foreign to them. For all, you've had the Act of Union since 1800, but there is still this very deep sense that Irish Catholics are kind of funny creatures, and we kind of love them, and they're very poetic and romantic, but they're also wild and they do these mad things. To be fair to them, the immediate evidence, if you were Maxwell, you would have thought, well, look, it's obvious that to the Irish population, these guys are crazy vandals. You have to remember that during Easter week, you would have had Dublin working class women turning up at the GPO to shout bad language at the rebels. You would have had while the the ones who were being just taken off to prison camp in Wales, while they're being led down to the docks. I mean, Dublin population are throwing rubbish at them. Largely, we think these were mostly working class women whose husbands and sons were off of the Western Front. Remember, these are, colloquially known as the separation women, because they were getting the separation allowances, which, remember, this is dire poverty. I mean, this is, these are people who live in terrible conditions. And so the money is very important to them, but also the sense of these people are betraying my Johnny, my Paddy, who's out there. This is very strong. So in the immediate sense, it's not unreasonable for Maxwell to think, actually, the Irish public will be okay with this. The Irish newspapers, the Irish Times, which at the time was the sort of Protestant Unionist paper, is of course demanding executions. But the leading Catholic newspaper, Irish nationalist Catholic newspaper, the Irish Independent, is much more vitriolic. And even when the executions have started and they've done enough, there's this sort of delay, particularly James Connolly is kind of left because Connolly is essentially dying. Connolly's been shot. The idea of taking out this very badly wounded man who's, as it turns out, when he's executed, is more or less unconscious. I mean, executing an unconscious man is terrible. The Irish Independent is saying, do it, go on, kill him, And this is to do with disdain for Connolly socialism. He's a troublemaker, get rid of these people. So you can kind of understand to some extent why the authorities think this will be okay. But then what they completely miss is the religious aspect of this. They miss the fact that actually the calculation about Easter, the calculation about blood sacrifice was right. This becomes a religious drama. And it's the religious drama of Christ dying for us to redeem our sins. There's this very strong sense that, yes, these are mad people. Maybe they're kind of misguided, they're misled, but they have redeemed Ireland somehow. They redeemed our shame, the humiliation of colonialism, all that has been kind of somehow they've paid a blood price for that. And they're our lads. I mean, you can't underestimate the fact that Dublin's a small place. It's 110,000 or 120,000 or something. People know these people, they're around the place. W.B. Yeats's justly famous poem, Easter 1916, starts, I have seen them at the close of day. I know these guys. And, Yeats's poem is all about basically saying, I kind of used to laugh at them and I didn't think much of them. And now they're transfigured, all's changed utterly, a terrible beauty is born. And that sort of transfiguration is to do with martyrdom. And martyrdom is a very deeply religious idea.
You might say then, given what you've just said, that the miscalculation was to hold these so-called trials in secret, in that once they had the letter from Pierce, more or less saying, we're doing this with the Germans, there are all these people in Dublin whose sons and husbands are fighting against the Germans. But the secrecy is the thing that actually feeds both that sense of sacrifice. Also, it's treating them as soldiers, because these are drumhead court-martials. Whereas a sort of common or garden public trial, criminal trial of a sort, might have been the way to go if you're thinking from the British point of view. It feels like that possibly was the miscalculation.
Absolutely. Or even actually just do what they did with most of the rebels, which after all, they just shipped them off into a prison camp in Wales, leave them to rot there, and we'll come back to it when the war is over, see where we are then. It didn't make sense, except the weird thing seems to be that they're both underestimating and overestimating the public response to the rising. So the panic to kill them, and to make an example is to do with overestimating the threat and thinking, oh, maybe there are more of them out there. Maybe, if we don't make an example, this will happen again soon, which wasn't true. There really wasn't any likelihood of that happening. But then they're underestimating this sort of sympathy. And you made a point, David, which is really important, right? That actually, oddly enough, killing a few people is much worse in propaganda terms than killing a lot, right? Because everybody can identify with the individuals. It becomes very personal, and you have the widows around, you have the stories of these men. A critical thing that happens is, right, so the Catholic Church hierarchy is, broadly speaking, very opposed to the rising, to the rebels, doesn't like Connolly, doesn't like that socialist element of course, as well, and is pretty appalled by it. But a significant number of Catholic priests and of the Catholic hinterland kind of swings in behind the rising. There's a ballad which is written, what do they say, that that the winners write the history and the losers write the ballads, and the ballads are very powerful in Ireland. And you have a famous ballad still sung called The Foggy Jew, which I think appears, I mean, within about a month or so, and it's written by a Catholic priest, and it's brilliant, and it's about the Angelus bell or the Liffey swell rang out or the foggy dew, and it's using this kind of language while Britannia's Huns with her long range guns shot out over the foggy dew. So Britain is now the Huns. These are entirely envisaged as Catholic martyrs. And the weird thing is that the rebels themselves have really kind of bought into this. So even those who were very skeptical of the Catholic nature of it, like James Connolly, Connolly ends up praying, and of course, they're about to be executed. I'm not, but interestingly, we're going to come to Roger Casement. I mean, Casement is a Protestant. I mean, Casement converts to Catholicism as almost part of the rising. It becomes very quickly understood as a Catholic ritual, Catholic public ritual. And it's impossible to get back from that. And the British, mostly Protestant, mostly suspicious of all this Catholic stuff, are just very bad at dealing with it. This will be paralleled much later when you think about the hunger strikes, the IRA hunger strikes in 1981, where again, the hunger strikers play into blood sacrifice, the Catholic psychological world. And Margaret Thatcher, who's on the other side, just doesn't get it. I mean, just cannot understand. Why would anybody have sympathy with these people? It's just, they're criminals. So it is a clash of cultures that's also going on here, I think. And that failure to understand turns out to be pretty fatal for the British cause.
You said at the start of this conversation that a calculation had to be made, including from people who thought this is not going to succeed. We know this is not going to succeed, but in the long run, it might deliver for us, particularly in the context of a war that's being fought for the self-determination of small nations. Patrick Pearse, in his speech from the dock, which there is a record, among other things, he says he's ready to die. He's almost inviting it, but also, as you say, therefore invites it on others, including his brother. But he has a little bit where he says, this is a war where you, the people who are going to kill me, are fighting for Serbia and Belgium, and I'm fighting for Ireland. So tell me what I'm doing wrong. Does that resonate? Does that resonate? And does it resonate beyond Ireland? For instance, does it resonate in the United States?
It resonates very strongly in the United States, because the British are maneuvering to try and get the United States into the war. And Irish America is largely very actively opposed to America joining the war. In the end, of course, Wilson does, but it's a close run thing. And so this does have an effect. And it's going to really resonate at the end of the war and the Versailles Peace Conference, which is who gets represented here? Wilsonian democracy, the right of self-determination, is placed at the heart of Versailles. And quite reasonably, not just Ireland, but you've the Vietnamese, for example, going to the peace conference saying, what was that thing about self-determination? What was the thing about fighting for small nations? Or why won't you listen to us? Why can we not be represented? And of course, it turns out that when we said small nations and self-determination, we meant those that were conquered or part of the empire, so the defeated, the belligerents, not us, And of course, it is a fundamental contradiction that Britain actually has no coherent or rational way of solving. And, the Irish question is going to be where push comes to shove on all of this.
So is it possible to say that this is a story of miscalculation on all sides, multiple miscalculation, but that view that the theatricality of this event conceivably in the medium term, never mind the long term, but in the medium term, is a route to a kind of victory, that was not a miscalculation?
I mean, Pierce's letter to the mother, whatever about the postscript, I mean, where he says, people will curse us now. And he means the Irish people, he doesn't mean the Brits, he means the Irish people will curse us now. But you will live to be blessed because you were my mother. I mean, right up to the 1940s, I think Margaret Pierce was still alive and she was a kind of heroine of the Irish nation. And she'd given birth to these two martyrs and, all that stuff is going to feed in. It's not a simple, it's never simple, of course. It's not just that the reaction to the executions turns the Irish public suddenly in favour of independence rather than home rule, but it's a big factor. And it sort of primes the Irish people, the Catholic population in particular, for what will be kind of struggles to come. So the British do then make a second huge miscalculation in 1917, whereas they try to introduce conscription. So whatever about, you've been shooting our boys, then saying, by the way, whether you like it or not, you're going to be sent off to the Western Front. The combination of those two things, I think, is fatal for the allegiance of, and remember, most Irish Catholics at this time, before the Rising, were looking for home rule within the United Kingdom and within the Empire. And so what changes is the idea of Irish independence outside the Empire has gone mainstream by 1918, by the end of the war.
The second part of this conversation is going to be available on Saturday on PPF Plus as one of our bonus episodes. If you would like to hear it, just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com, and sign up to PPF Plus now to get the archive of all of our bonus episodes, but also this conversation about Roger Casement, who is one of the most interesting figures of 20th century political history. Here's a clip of what Fintan and I discuss.
He's approached initially by, I think it's Casement's cousin and Beatrice Webb, the famous socialist Fabian, who was one of Shaw's closest political collaborators in Fabianism, Fabian socialism, all that. And they approach him basically looking for money. They basically say, will you fund Casement's defence? And Shaw says, well, no, I won't. And I'll tell you why I won't, because, and this is where he enters the story, right, where he says, what you're looking for is you're going to hire the best lawyers. They're going to, because they're going to be charging you a lot of money, they're going to, drag out a big kind of elaborate defense. It's going to completely fail because he was colluding with, it's ridiculous trying to say he's not guilty. What you need to do is something completely different. And so Shaw, as I said, he's an Irish nationalist in a lot of ways, but he's very skeptical of the Irish tradition of martyrdom. There's a famous line in one of his plays, earlier plays, The Devil's Disciples, where he says, "Martyrdom, sir," this is General Burgoyne, a set in American War of Independence. Burgoyne says, "Martyrdom, sir, is what these people want. It's the only way in which a man can become famous without ability." you know? So he's not into martyrdom, and so the 1916 Rising had become all about martyrdom. The whole story now is about this. And Shaw is saying, look, what are we trying to do here? Let's try and keep Casement alive. How is there a possibility that he might not be martyred? And he says the only possibility is that he dispenses with legal counsel. He dispenses with don't go along with the show trial. This is about British justice. He says, if you do that, they'll be delighted. The better your lawyers, the more satisfied the British establishment will be. They'll say, he got such a fair trial. He was brilliantly represented. The Lord Chief Justice will say, what a wonderful defense was put up, and then we'll hang him. And he says, no, you've got to not do that. The Irish tradition is you make your speech from the dock after you've been condemned. It's too late. Or the gallows tree speech. That's the whole Irish martyrdom tradition. He says, make your speech before. And remember, this is not just a conventional trial, it's a jury trial. There is a jury, of London gentlemen there. And he says, I'm going to write the speech. What he says to Beatrice Webb and to Casement's cousin is, you're missing the point. He says, this is a national drama, and it must be staged as a national drama.
To get that, sign up to PPF Plus now. Next time in our regular slot, in Politics on Trial, I'm going to be talking about the trial that should have finished off Adolf Hitler, but ended up being the making of him, the Beer Hall Putsch trial of 1924. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.